Alright, so this is my Traxxas TRX3. I actually haven't made a video on this thing in a couple of years, and that's mostly because I've been focusing on other two-wheel drive buggies to run at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals. But the 2023 Vonets just finished recently, and I've been thinking about what to run for next year, and the TRX3 has been very high on my list, so I figured I'd get a head start on putting it all together, putting electronics in, setting it up, making it kind of ready to go. So I'm going to walk you through what I did to this car. You can probably see if you have a trained eye, it's not completely box stock, but it's mostly stock. This car is a very tunable car, and you don't need to make that many modifications to it. So I'll just walk straight through them. So let's start with the front end. One thing you can notice is that I'm not running the stock Traxxas wheels. I'm running hex wheels front and rear. So the way that you do it on the front, there's a couple of ways. One approach I've seen people take is to run Traxxas Slash or Bandit front caster blocks and front spindle carriers. And the wheel axle for that sort of runs through the back of the spindle carrier, through a set of bearings. There's a pin on the front, and you put a hex on there. And you can mount hex front wheels that way. I don't really like the way that looks, is that spindle carrier, or the caster block, sorry, looks really chunky. Doesn't really look vintage. But also, I actually have had trouble even just getting it to fit. I'm not completely sure how people have really done that before. But nonetheless, that's something people have tried. I kept the stock caster block, and what I did is I switched to the Traxxas number 1637 steering blocks. So it's a different steering block than what you get on the TRX3 as stock. The actual arm itself has less throw, okay? And this arm is symmetrically placed vertically. On the TRX3 spindle carrier, as you can see, the arm is biased toward one side, okay? And the reason for that is because when you go full lock on the steering, that arm is going to come through and run over a little bit of the front arm. So you need enough clearance to be able to do that. Now, the reason why I went to this spindle carrier is because the wheel axle itself is a different diameter. This wheel axle, I think, is a 6 millimeter, and this here is a 5. Sorry, I think this is a 5, this is a 4. That's probably the case. In any case, the reason for that is because I use these GPM hex adapters, which have two bearings on the inside. I think they're 4x8 bearings, possibly 5x8. Don't remember. But these mount onto the wheel axle, and then on the other side of the wheel, I put a thrust bearing. Yes, this is a 5 millimeter thrust bearing. So that's a 5 millimeter axle. That means this is 6 millimeters. In any case, I prefer to go this route. This seems to work better for me. It also allows me to use the original caster block. And the thing with using the thrust bearing on the outside here is that if you just have this hex adapter on the inside and then you tighten down your lock nut, that lock nut is going to bind against the wheel. And it's going to cause some friction when the wheel is trying to spin. So you're better off putting some kind of a bearing here. I use a thrust bearing as an interface between your lock nut and the actual wheel surface itself. So the wheel spins with the inside of the thrust bearing, and then the outside of the thrust bearing mates to the lock nut, and then the balls on the inside are what do the spinning. And I actually mount this lock nut, as you can see, upside down with the threading on the inside, so that way I have better control over how tight I can make it. If I go the other way, the threading will, the nylon lock part of the lock nut will just barely make it to the outside of the threading on the wheel axle. I won't have that much room to really tighten it down. So you want it to be, tightened enough so that the nut doesn't come off, but not so tight that it binds the wheel up. And you have, if you mount it inside out or upside down, if you will, the lock nut can move much further in and secure itself in place while also securing the thrust bearing. So that works perfectly fine. Other modifications. Well, we have some Lunsford turnbuckles, front and rear. That's just, let's call it period correct. And I love Lunsford turnbuckles. It's too bad they don't make them anymore. But one thing I did add here is to brace the front bulkhead. This is kind of like what you would see in a Yokomo 93 Works with a turnbuckle and two ball ends on either side. But you see these kinds of braces on like the RC10T and the RC10B2, and I think some of the low-C two-wheel drive buggies have this. The whole reason for having this brace here is that if you have a hard collision that pushes one of these arms back, you don't want to snap the bulkhead. Especially in a car like this where these bulkheads they don't make anymore and they're extremely difficult to find. I have not yet been able to find replacement bulkheads for the TRX3 or the TCP, essentially the same car. One thing you can do is get a Traxxas Bandit or Slash front bulkhead, and it's almost the exact same part. It's just a wider version of it. So you have to cut it down the middle and then trim a bit on both sides to get the right and left halves to mate in such a way so that you get the correct width. That would be a geometrically correct replacement for this bulkhead if it does break. And I do have one of those that I'll probably cut up just as like a backup just in case. But I figured I'd put this brace on here just as an extra security measure. Now the thing is, the original hinge pins that mount the front arms are not long enough to support the extra length you need to put this in here. But what is a perfect fit is the RC10T front arm inner hinge pin. And that is just enough to fit these particular types of ball ends. These are the stock Traxxas type ball ends that came with the chassis. I do not know the part number, but critically, the inside diameter of those ball ends fits over these hinge pins. The newer style Traxxas ball ends, let me find, I think I got one like over here. These guys right here. This part, the inside of this is actually too small to fit around this hinge pin. So don't use this part if you want to brace the bulkhead here. You have to find a different type of ball to fit that hinge pin. But nonetheless, I did that to brace the bulkhead. Hopefully that works. I don't crash very often, but just as an extra safety measure. As you can see, I have an A&L steering rack here. I did this, again, because parts for this car are very hard to find. The A&L racks are very strong, very durable. So I figured if anything were to break, I'd rather it wouldn't be the rack. So I put the steering rack aside. Oh, I have it somewhere. And I just replaced it with this. This also has the added benefit of adjustable Ackerman, which is very nice. Now, in order to set up the steering for me, I did have to do a little bit of cutting here on the upper deck. Normally there's a square-sized window here, and I had to trim a little bit towards the front. The reason for that is so that this turnbuckle can have clearance to the upper deck. Because when you mount the turnbuckle on the servo horn, you otherwise would have to mount it very low. And if I mount it too low, it will hit the servo as I'm turning to the right. So this needs to mount high enough to clear the servo, but I need to have enough room here on the front so that as I'm turning, say, to the right, that the turnbuckle and then the base of the ball end doesn't smack into the upper deck. So I had to do a little bit of trimming there. I didn't want to remove too much material because this upper deck here also provides stiffness for the chassis. Between the lower and upper deck, you don't want to remove too much material here or you'll get too much flex along the length of the chassis. So I just removed just enough of what I need to make clearance. So that's how that goes. And I also put some spacers under here on the inside to push this ball end up. Generally, when you set up your steering, you want this turnbuckle to be as flat as possible. So that way, just as you go off center to the left or the right, you have as much torque as possible being applied to the bell crank. If you have any sort of elevation, especially a very large elevation, you're kind of dividing your force that's being applied to the bell crank as you're pulling from the servo horn. So, okay, that's the front. Going to the middle here, the original style battery cup holder is just a little bar that goes right here. And if you have a shorty pack and you want to be able to move it backwards and forwards, that bar is not going to hold the pack if the pack is back here, for example. So I used a Kyosho RB6 style battery strap, And I did have to cut it to length just a little bit so that it clears the back here. I think actually this comes from either from an RB6 or an RT6, but nonetheless, one of the longer style ones. Fits perfectly, nothing really crazy there. Receivo speed control on either side. This is the widest part of the chassis here, so it fits very nicely. I'm using a Novak Kinetic. I have a bunch of Novak speed controls that I like to use, and I like the brand. Again, it's too bad they don't make them anymore, but I really like the Kinetic and the Pulse series. They're very good speed controls. So trying to equalize the weight distribution. This is just typical for what you'd see in a rear motor car. Going to the back here, is there anything special I did? There's a couple of things. So first and foremost, A&L power clutch. I actually had this power clutch in my Traxxas Rad 2, but I am decommissioning that car, or at least deprioritizing that car. So I took the power clutch out of that and put it into here. It was a bit of a pain because there's a pin on this. There's two pins on this shaft. There's one that holds the rear part of the slipper hub in place. That takes a bit of force to get it out, so I can get the shaft out. And there's another pin that holds down, or doesn't hold down, but it helps to hold in place the input gear. And taking that out was a lot harder. I didn't actually have to take that out, but as I was taking the whole thing apart, I thought I had to take that gear off, and in doing so I had to take that pin out, and removing that pin is very difficult, and that gear is held on with splines, so removing the gear is very difficult too. So I put a new gear back on, fresh gearing. It's a nylon molding, is it a molded gear? No, it's a cut gear. It's a nylon gear, very durable. So I put that in there to have fresh gears in the gearbox, so there's no dirt or scratches or anything mucking up the internals. This is a Robinson 75 tooth spur, one of the Pro Machine spurs. Made it to a 31 tooth pinion. I think this will give me a reasonable, in the right window for gearing for a 17.5 motor. The key thing about this spur gear is that some spur gears do have the right arrangement of holes to mount against the outer slipper hub here on the power clutch. Some of the Robinson gears have the correct arrangement, like the 75 tooth spur. But if you go down to their 72 tooth spur, the whole arrangement's different and it won't fit onto the power clutch. But the Kimbrough gears have a bit more of a classical hole arrangement that you do see on the Robinson gears as well, just not all of them. So this one also fits, but this is a 69 tooth. And to run a 69 tooth, I would need something like a 28 tooth pinion. I just don't have one, so I just sized up a little bit. So that's just minor detail there. The drivetrain, one thing that people used to do is run the MIP CVD set for the TRX3. Those are pretty hard to find, although they do exist, and they're expensive. The more economical approach that achieves the exact same effect is to run some Kyosho parts. It's kind of odd to think that Kyosho parts are cheaper in this case, but the old Optima and Laser style diff outdrive pieces here, they mate perfectly onto the diff outdrive shaft for these Traxxas diffs, and you just use this little grub screw here to tighten it down onto that output shaft, and then you use a 62.5 millimeter Kyosho CVA, and then on the outside on the wheel axle I have a 10 millimeter wide wheel hex, which gives me the correct offset so I can run a modern Kyosho rim here. The only thing is there's not a whole lot of thread left on the wheel axle, so I have to use a pretty shallow, well, it could be shallow or it could be a standard, but it has to be a serrated nut, because a lock nut won't have enough thread to hold this in place. So you got to use a serrated nut and really tighten it down, but it does hold in place okay. So this is a TRX3. There's really, again, most of this is stock. There's not a whole lot that you need to do to the car, I don't think. I replaced all the screws with hex screws just to make it easier to work on. So far in replacing the screws and getting a feel for how the car is to work on, it's a pretty easy car to work on. There's not that much that's all that complicated. The only thing that could be a bit of a pain would be adjusting the rear intercambling positions. On this side, just getting in there, like over the motor is going to be tricky unless you have a ball end on a 2mm hex wrench. And then on this side here, right, it's just like any rear motor two-wheel drive buggy. Getting in here, you also need a ball end with a hex wrench, or you have to take the spur gear off to reach that. So I tried to use a hole position that I think is the right hole position for the track that I'm likely to race at. So hopefully that works well enough. Next steps: under tray, body, new wing. So those are coming in the mail from Penguin RC over in the UK. This is a brand new chassis, by the way, so I do want to run an under tray to protect it. And then tuning. I don't know exactly. I've never really worked with Traxxas shocks before, other than on the Rad 2. And even then, the work was very limited. But I have some guesses as to what kinds of pistons and oils and springs I want to use. So I'll have to work on that over time. But this is mostly ready to go, and it's just waiting to run for next year, the Vintage Nationals. One thing I will also bring for rear motor buggies is probably the Pro X. This would be like the 4th year that I would be bringing it and trying to make it work right. But I want to try it again. So this will be probably the top choice to run. And then I'll bring the Pro X and maybe one of my RC10s. We'll see. I don't think I'll get the Low CXX ready in time. And even if I did, it's such a frail car. I'd be too afraid to really push it hard. So I'm not so sure yet as to whether I'm even going to get that ready for next year. But in any case, this is the TRX3. Really excited to run it. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching.